We have a lot to cover today. We don't want to miss anything. And excuse me. This will be our second panel. It's turning out to be a fabulous conference. Excuse me. And this will be obviously focusing on the African American military experience. And our panel chair, is State Representative Bryon who was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1982. He is the majority whip of the House. He came to the legislature with a work background of community organizing and Afro-American history. From 1972 to 1985, he was president of the Museum of African American History. Under his direction, the museum purchased and began restoration of the African Meeting House. And if you were there last night, you would have seen one beautiful building. And developed the Black Heritage Trail. In 1979, he oversaw the lobbying effort in Congress to establish the Boston African American National Historic Site, a component of the National Park Service. Bryon led the museum in the study of the history of Roxbury and conducted the archaeological investigation of the Southwest Corridor through Roxbury for the MBTA. He stays involved in this work, and as a legislator, he sponsored the creation of the Roxbury Heritage State Park, occasionally leading walking tours of African Americans and working class neighborhoods in Boston and Roxbury, and is leading the revitalization of the Roxbury Historical Society. He is a trustee of the Boston Public Library and of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I will turn over the microphone to Bryon.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure to be able to be with you all at this important conference and to be able to moderate this panel on the war. And it is the war, I think, that is bringing us all here. And so we will be spending the next few minutes talking about that part of all of this history, the actual military history in the Civil War. I am going to reluctantly not be like those moderators who deliver a paper before the panel because I didn't get invited to deliver a paper. I am really going to be a moderator and represent you, I hope, in this. I only want to set these excellent papers that we were about to hear in one context, and that is the context of military history from the point of view of African Americans. African Americans have always found their involvement in the military history of this country before its independence and after its independence as key to their history. And so from the celebration and discussions of the mythic Crispus Attucks to the great work before the Civil War, the first written history of military African American history by William C. Nell in the 1850s, there has been always this concern for holding up African American soldiers and sailors in the whole history of African America. What is been over the years somehow ignored is how remarkable and unique was the participation of African Americans in the Civil War. At no time had 200,000 African Americans been pretty much voluntarily engaged in an enterprise in American history until the Civil War. And after the Civil War, even though the Civil War experience, except for the Navy, was generally a segregated military experience, and the military stayed segregated, African Americans were actually displaced from that position. And it was not until the Vietnamese War that you had the percentage of African Americans on the ground that are in battle that approached the percentage of African Americans who are on the ground in battle in the Civil War. So it's that setting, both the meaning of this inside the African American community and the actuality of the remarkable number of Africans engaged in this enterprise that becomes the setting for these several papers. I would like to introduce all of our speakers so that we won't even lose the time of me getting up and down introducing speakers. We will begin by a paper from Professor Russell Duncan. Russell Duncan is professor of history at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. He is the author or editor of a dozen books, including Blue-Eyed Child of Fortune, the Civil War Letters of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. And he is currently writing a monthly article for a Chinese literary and historical journal focusing on contemporary American and Chinese politics. He is researching Destroying Babylon, Colonel James Montgomery and the Fight for Freedom, and the title of his lecture today will be Fight for It Yourself, Then You Is Happy, Then You Is Satisfied, Colonel James Montgomery and the 2nd South Carolina Infantry. And then we will hear from Richard Reid, who is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Guelph, Ontario, Canada, and he will be bringing us into our other theme for this whole conference of the international implications of the Civil War. He is the author of several books in Canadian and American history, including Freedom for Themselves, North Carolina's Black Soldiers in the Civil War, his latest book, To Fight for Liberty, Justice, and Equality, Black British North Americans in the American Civil War, and his paper will be on Citizens and Sojourners, Black British North Americans in the American Civil War. And then we will hear from Gretchen Long, Associate Professor of History at Williams College. Gretchen Long is an Associate Professor of History and Chair of the Africana Studies Department there at Williams College. Her recent book, Doctoring Freedom, The Politics of African American Medical Care in Slavery and Emancipation, was published in October. She holds fellowships at the Newberry Library in Chicago and at the Du Bois Center for African American Studies at Harvard University. Her paper is entitled Things We Need in Health and Sickness, Meaning and Medical Care for Black Soldiers. And we will have as our final panelist Donald Shaffer, Professor of History, the American Public University System. He will be speaking on Celebration and Agitation, the Black Civil War Veterans Reunion at Boston's Tremont Temple, August 1887. Donald Shaffer is the author of After the Glory, The Struggles of Black Civil War Veterans, and the co-author of Voices of Emancipation, Understanding Slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction through the United States Pension Bureau files. He teaches college-level history exclusively online and regularly posts to his blog, Civil War Emancipation. And we'll give you that URL afterwards. And so let us begin now with Professor Russell Duncan.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I also would like to thank Donald Yakovin for setting up the conference and doing things that only Donald can do to get this going. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of my research on the 2nd South Carolina Colored Infantry and its Colonel James Montgomery. Now, this is the way I do my class, so I'm going to do this. These are some of the reasons that we should care about the South Carolina Colored Infantry, and these are a few of the things most people know about the regiment itself, and I will talk about many of these today. They deal with emancipation. When John Brown first went to Kansas, he sent a letter to his son in Ohio telling him, "I am now writing in the log cabin of the notorious James Montgomery, a very intelligent, kind, gentlemanly, and most excellent man, and lover of freedom. He understands my system of warfare exactly." In truth, Montgomery had been among the first men to declare a war on slave owners, and he had done this many years before Lincoln and others would come around to his way of thinking. Historian Dudley Cornish noted that Harvard rules of fair play were not suited for the war in the territories. Thomas Higginson, the romantic, had raised money to send Sharp's rifles to Kansas, Cornish wrote. Montgomery, the realist, had used them. For Montgomery, only violent men made freedom possible. It was the same in 1863 when Montgomery unleashed total war and Robert Gould Shaw and Thomas Wentworth Higginson complained and pursued a more civilized approach. Montgomery, the Kansas man, was not quite an abolitionist, but he came as close to abolition as an anti-slavery man could get. He fought for human rights, if not always, for human equality. When the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act opened lands to settlers, he quickly claimed a homestead and became a leader of the Free State Men. The New York Times and New York Tribune featured stories about him, and he was most likely the man for whom the word jayhawker was invented. In 1856, as Kansas bled openly, as Charles Sumner had his skull cracked open and as Lawrence was sacked, Montgomery led a justice movement, and that's what he called it, a justice movement, and he headed a company of between 50 and 300 men. He destroyed ballot boxes, he killed U.S. soldiers, he shot at Texas Rangers, and he burned Fort Scott, because the soldiers there were on the pro-slavery side. By the time Lincoln issued his proclamation in 1863, Montgomery had been killing white men in Kansas for nearly 9 years. 2 days after Christmas in 1862, Montgomery met with Lincoln in the White House. He talked about John Brown. He talked about recruiting men into the Army. He was present when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Then Montgomery set off for Beaufort, South Carolina with orders from Stanton to raise a contraband regiment. He hopped a steamer bound for Key West, and in just over 2 weeks there, he signed up 120 men and returned to Beaufort with them. Montgomery believed that only aggressive actions brought progressive rewards. He often invoked accountability, and he repeatedly told his men to be active in the cause of freedom. The 2nd South Carolina then first engaged the enemy in an expedition to Jacksonville, Florida in March 1863. They enrolled more men there. They went on to the plantations where some of them had been slaves. They looked for their wives. They looked for their friends. They looked for revenge. There was great fear among the white Southerners that the notorious Kansas jayhawker was leading a black army in a servile insurrection and war on slavery. And they were right. He was doing just that. His men loved to sing, it also scared the white Southerners, his men loved to sing the song John Brown's Body as they marched along. We heard Lois Brown's talk, and Harriet Tubman certainly is important to the story of James Montgomery. Harriet Tubman insisted on working with Montgomery. She favored him in the sense that he understood what she was about, and he understood what she was doing as well. So you can see them sitting together and discussing what should be done. Combahee. The name is famous only because of the 727 men, women, and children who went from slavery to freedom in the course of a couple of hours on the 2nd of June, 1863. Tubman, Montgomery, and 300 men of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment raided upriver, and they came upon 1,000 slaves, maybe more, working in the fields. Historian Willie Lee Rose wrote that where Higginson's raids sought men to be recruited into the Union Army, Montgomery's raids were massive assaults upon property. Slaves were freed, houses were burned, rice fields were ruined, and plunder was taken aboard the ships. So it must have been spectacular, fantastic. The next day, June the 3rd, 1863, when Montgomery arrived back in Beaufort with 300 soldiers and 700 genuine contrabands, still wearing their field suits of dirty gray, as Willie Lee Rose put it. But it was also truly special because by the rarest of coincidences, I suppose, there was the simultaneous arrival of 1,000 model soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. So Montgomery is coming in with 1,000 people basically on his ship, and Shaw is arriving with 1,000 model soldiers from Massachusetts and the north, and Higginson's 1,000 soldiers are standing nearby. The 54th Massachusetts men thought in terms of equality and manhood. Montgomery's men thought in terms of freedom and deliverance from evil. The moment of emancipation, that is freedom, met the promise of emancipation, equality, on that day in Beaufort 150 years ago. The Combahee people had lived in seclusion most of their lives and had learned incomplete truths. Now, the fact of all these black men in blue uniforms and white missionaries all around them spoke not to the rule of law. They couldn't have cared less about that. It spoke to the power of higher law. Montgomery and Tubman took the refugees to a church. This is still June the 3rd. They spoke to them of freedom and Christian duty before Montgomery ordered all able-bodied men to be immediately drafted into his regiment. Then he addressed them. "You are to be as free as the winds of heaven," he said, "but all depends upon your courage, your obedience to orders, and your constancy in the work of crushing this rebellion." One of the men echoed Montgomery's words about freedom. He told a reporter, "Fight for it yourself, then you is happy, then you is satisfied." Those words express the sacred belief in the power of the individual actor to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Eric told us about this last night. Montgomery sometimes approved leave for men to visit their families. After all, he was in the area where the families lived. He also allowed women into the camp. The contrabands had plenty of courage. They were willing to fight. If we put freedom and equality aside for just a moment, these men were in their home areas. They had wives and children and friends a mile in that direction, 2 miles that way, maybe 10 miles upriver this way. Higginson said they fought with ropes around their necks. Sure, they wanted equal pay, but their lives and their futures did not depend on that. The 54th Massachusetts could go home when the war ended, win or lose, but these men were home, and they must win the war or freedom and equality would not be possible for them. 1 week before the Combee rescue, Montgomery took his brand new soldiers, now 500 strong. And if you can imagine, there's no time to train. You sign the soldiers in, you put them into uniforms, you hand them a smoothbore. They were not using infield rifles. They had smoothbores made by Prussian and Austrians. You let them shoot maybe 2 or 3 shots, and then you take them upriver to Reid. So Montgomery has 500 brand new soldiers, along with 700 men of the 54th Massachusetts on a raid up the Altamaha River to Darien, Georgia. In the town square, there was a jail and a whipping post with chains attached. Stood it had always been there. Montgomery declared, "I shall burn this town. Southerners must be swept away by the hand of God, like the Jews of old." Montgomery put the torch to the whipping stand with his own hands. He quoted Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, while he was doing it. "And he who stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death." Well, Shaw was outraged. We know that. He called it a dirty piece of business. He thought that his troops would be would end up being harassed by the press and others about their participation in this incident. Shaw and his men equated honor with the courage to die in battle. "We shall take the fort or die there," Shaw said. Montgomery equated honor with the destruction of slavery. And he told a New York Times reporter, "Arm all the Negroes and they will suppress this rebellion." He was right, and he knew it. In a tribute to Montgomery, one writer said, "The great object of his life has been to elevate the Negro. He is an admirer of those who are willing to shoulder the musket and fight for freedom without grumbling at every adverse thing that happens to arise." Private Charles Carr, 5 feet 5 inches tall, 2nd South Carolina, was born in the Congo. His father's name was Mingo and his sister Rose. They were all brought from Africa in the slave ship Wanderer, and they were slaves on the Aiken plantation in Savannah. The Wanderer unloaded 409 slaves at Jekyll Island in 1858, and how many of these joined the Union Army is unknown. How many of them later joined to fight with Tunis Campbell and other African American reformers who were setting up governments in the South and getting ex-slaves to vote is also unknown. I'll end this now. For the most part, the men were examined, they were stripped of their clothes, they were bathed. The procedure of enrolling them into the Army could happen either before they were enrolled or afterward. Montgomery wasn't much for red tape. The wife of Private Ned Snipe remembered, "I was a girl when the stars fell. I married Ned under the flag with all the regiments standing around us, and I have a certificate signed by Colonel James Montgomery." The companies were formed geographically. They were made up of men who knew each other. Companies A and B came from Key West. They enlisted freely, they were free men, they were well-fed, healthy, and reasonably literate. A couple of these men may have been white men posing as black men to join the regiment. The company was light-skinned. Company C came from Jacksonville, Fernandina, and from the men who had been freed and taken refuge in Beaufort. If we stay along the color line, these men were browner. Companies D and E were the Combahee men, and they were black. Culture and degrees of freedom separated the companies and led to competition among the men. Companies A and B were more likely to protest unequal pay. Company C fought steadily for freedom. Companies D and E also fought steadily for freedom, but they were the most loyal to Montgomery, even though they were also the most likely to desert because of the proximity of their families. The story of Montgomery and the 2nd South Carolina focuses on the transition from slavery to freedom. They were not fighting for equal pay, a more perfect union, or to end racial prejudice. They did not risk their lives for those goals. The main goals were wrapped up in the give me liberty or give me death, don't tread on me, beliefs in individual responsibility. Montgomery had learned that in the Kansas Wars. Now, in South Carolina, the answer by the former slave in the very day of his freedom and swearing into the Army echoed this belief. Fight for it yourself. Then you is happy. Then you is satisfied. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking Dawn and the rest of the committee for inviting me down from Ontario, where I can assure you now there are no flowering trees. I also want to thank Steve in the earlier session for making a compelling case for the importance of looking at small, marginal communities to answer larger, broader questions, because what I'm looking at, the research that I've done, looked at the young black men both born in British North America and African Americans residing there, who left that area, what would become Canada 2 years after the Civil War was over, to serve in the Civil War. They serve a useful lens, I think, for a series of reasons. Okay. I have a PowerPoint that's supposed to be up. The numbers and where they come from give us a clearer impression of the transnational ties that existed between black communities both in the United States and in the various British colonies. The action, okay, yeah. The action of the recruits also gives us a sense of the international response among black communities outside the United States to the Emancipation Proclamation and the call for a war against slavery. And finally, the timing of their enlistment helps us understand the complex motivation of the, I'll call them African Canadians, although many from the Maritimes would have resisted that, who volunteer, and perhaps their explanation also helps explain African American motivation. Well, I need to start off by giving you a sense of what I was attempting to do. I wanted to identify all of the black Civil War soldiers and sailors who were born in or who claimed to be born in any of the colonies making up British North America. Men like Bryon. The enlistment records, certainly by 1863, include the purported nativity of the recruits. There were reasons why both African Americans and African Canadians might lie about where they were born, but even those lies were instructive. While the focus of the study was primarily on the men claiming birth in British North America, and by that I really mean the British North American colonies in the east of what will become Canada, including Canada divided into Canada West and East, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Well, I look at that primarily because I can accurately identify them. I've also made the assumption that African Americans residing in those colonies were at least as likely to enlist as were native-born British North Americans. Much of the information that I've found is captured in Table 1, showing the numbers of volunteers from each of the colonies. There were significant different responses from Canada East and West and the Maritimes, and that in turn reflected the different makeup of their black communities. 57% of the black population in Canada West had been born in an American state, while there were very few US-born black residents in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, or Prince Edward Island. This demographic difference in turn created much stronger transnational connections between Canada West and the neighboring states. It's not surprising, therefore, that the turnout of volunteers is much higher in Canada West, Canada East. In other words, place and connections matter. And yet, on the other hand, Every British colony, even tiny Prince Edward Island, sent black volunteers to the war. Even within those colonies with limited physical ties to the United States and with very few African American sojourners, there were clearly emotional and intellectual connections in these black communities outside the United States. So, I was surprised by the number of black volunteers from British North America, almost 2,500. But the obvious question to ask is just how significant were those numbers? Or phrasing it differently, clearly there was an international response to the Emancipation Proclamation, a response linked to the transnational ties of the various colonies. But how do you put it in a meaningful context? One way to compare the turnout of the black soldiers from British North America is to measure the different rates of black enlistment with the northern states. Because the Canadian census does not have the category of men of military age, I've had to use the black population as a whole in my comparison. In the Canadas, black volunteers made up over 13% of the black population. In the Maritimes, it was 6.1 and 2%, I think. The number of black recruits coming from British North America is all the more remarkable because it occurred despite the British government's effort to prevent it. At the start of the war, the British government declared its neutrality and evoked the seldom used Foreign Enlistment Act of 1819, which, among other things, prohibited its citizens from joining in the army or navy of another nation at war. Some young black men from Canada West were in fact prosecuted in the British colonies during the war for trying to join the Union Army. Well, how did the turnout from British North America compare with that from African Americans in the United States? Well, in the northern states, there was also considerable variation when you look at the number of black recruits credited to the various states as a percentage of the black population, in part because they're talking about it being credited rather than born in. For the northern states as a whole, the rate is about 17.5%. Of course, in making any comparison, you have to remember that by 1864, African Americans were held liable to the draft, and that coercion would have increased their numbers, while British North Americans who volunteered did so despite the threat of the Foreign Enlistment Act. Now, how much historians may wish to make of these comparisons will probably vary, but at the very least, they indicate that the Emancipation Proclamation and the opportunity to fight against the Confederacy strongly resonated in black communities outside the United States, while at the same time, the final decisions of the young black men were influenced by a whole range of local and personal factors. Last point, last theme. I also found the timing of the Canadian or African-Canadian enlistment provided a clue to better understand their motivation. And their motivation is going to be, complex. But when Canadian historians have discussed the motives of men who went south to enlist, they've often stressed, at least for white volunteers, the money being offered in bounties or paid substitutes, money that increased as the war progressed. When black volunteers are discussed, and that's not often among Canadian historians, ideology is presumed to be the prime motive. A graph of the timing of the black enlistment helps make the black decision-making clearer, I think. The numbers increase through 63 and early 64, and then fell off significantly and did not pick up until the late summer of 64, after which black North Americans enlisted in record numbers. Some might look at the graph and correlate the increased volunteering in late 64 and 65 to the increase in bounty monies and substitute fees, but I would differ. The appeal to black volunteers took two forms. As soon as a specific regiment was authorized, and the 54th is a good example, organizers fanned out across the northern states and beyond, because some came to Canada, to find black recruits to fill the ranks. The many black men in British North America responded to these calls. The formation of the regiments such as the 54th and 55th, early in 63, or the establishment of the 5th Massachusetts, the 29th Connecticut, and the 1st Michigan Colored Volunteers, later in 63 and into early 64, explain that first bulge among recruits. The second form of appeal came in the wake of a series of national calls made by President Lincoln for more soldiers. This is too crowded a slide, but the four major calls in October 63, March, July, and December are shown on the graph. Oops. Had the wrong one. A, B, D, and E. Well, there's a close correlation between the organization of the various regiments and the men from British North America coming. There was little correlation between Lincoln's call for more men in 63 and 64 and the response from black North Americans. Why? My own answer would be that the initial action of the War Department left many potential black recruits in British North America in the spring of 64 feeling angry, betrayed, misled, apprehensive, and unappreciated. This story is familiar to you, and you've heard it in other ways before. Organizers of the first black regiments promised equal pay and equal treatment to the young recruits filling their ranks. What they received once they entered was very different. In the summer of 63, they learned that they would receive a lower rate of pay than the white soldiers, while at the same time they found themselves doing most of the heavy lifting and little fighting. Their equipments, weapons, rations were frequently inferior to the white soldiers. Competent black sergeants were denied commissions, even as white privates were made officers in the black regiments. In early 64, the Canadian press carried stories of Confederate atrocities against the black soldiers. Fort Pillow and Plymouth, North Carolina show up in the Canadian press. As a result, by June, the number of blacks leaving British North America to enlist had fallen to a handful, an increase, and also desertion among Canadians had picked up. Then black volunteering shot up. The highly symbolic pay issue had been resolved, while black soldiers were also gaining equal rights to federal bounties. Now their treatment in the field was closer to that of white soldiers, and numerous white officers had made clear that Confederate atrocities would be met by retaliation man for man. I would argue that it's only after the black communities in British North America become convinced that the Union government was actually treating black soldiers more equitably that the volunteering from the British colonies begins to pick up and responds to Lincoln's calls. But what about the issue of pay? Did African Americans go south for cash? Yes and no. There were growing financial incentives to join the Army by late 1864, and certainly young black men who went south came from a hard-scrabble background. The vast majority of the volunteers were farmers, farm workers, laborers. They had few financial resources to leave behind to their dependents if they enlisted, especially if they were to be away for 3 years. And certainly by the fall of 1864, some enlistment districts paid out bonuses that averaged $1,000. Substitutes could hope to get as much. But while the money was clearly important for many of the men, sizable bounties and substitute fees had been available in early 64 when few Canadians enlisted. This one, the 1st Michigan, was paying $600 for some men. The money by itself was insufficient to guarantee enlistment, at least among the African Canadians. The increased enlistment in the late 64 and 65, I argue, reveals a closer correlation with a renewed belief in the British colonies that black recruits would be treated fairly. And I want to end by coming back to the repercussions of the Emancipation Proclamation and to point out some of its long-term impact on the black communities in Canada. After 1865, few African Americans felt the need to move north to create new lives. At the same time, thousands of African Canadians increasingly sought out new social and economic opportunities in the United States. The result was a slow decline of the black population in Canada for a half century after the Civil War. It was just one of the international effects of emancipation. Thank you.
Hello. In 1901, Henry Turner, African-American Civil War veteran and lifelong activist, was in frail health as he approached 70 years of age. That year, he wrote to the U.S. Commissioner of Pensions in Washington requesting a government pension. Turner had been a leading abolitionist who had enlisted as a chaplain for the colored troops. Throughout the war, he wrote for the Colored American, providing accounts of black troops' consistent valor in battle. After the war, he was an outspoken activist in Reconstruction politics in Georgia, and he later served as bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and was elected to the Georgia State Legislature. By 1901, despite his professional success, he had become thoroughly disillusioned with the failure of Reconstruction to guarantee African Americans fair labor conditions or meaningful political rights. The Democratic Party had prevented him from taking up his first term in the legislature in 1868, and he faced numerous other setbacks both in state politics and in leadership of the AME Church. The request for a government pension is particularly poignant in light of Turner's political stance toward the end of his life. Despite his lack of faith in the promises of the nation, Turner felt that his financial situation, advancing age, and physical infirmity left him no choice but to apply for a pension. He began his letter to the commissioner by explaining that his role as an Army chaplain had not shielded him from active combat. He was with his regiment in, quote, 11 of the 13 bloody battles and 24 skirmishes, unquote. He wrote that he was injured when a horse fell with me at Warsaw, North Carolina, while being chased by Confederate soldiers, but I was borne away by my comrades and have been afflicted from it from that day to this. Turner explained that although he had been out of the military for decades, he'd never before made a claim for military pension since he, quote, I have expected to die for a number of years and resolved not to ask for a pension. Indeed, he had never requested one since the war terminated in the freedom of my race. Turner claimed that his understanding of his wounds between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century turned on a conception that linked them to the price paid for freedom, no matter how paltry that freedom had become. As a disabled and elderly African American veteran, Turner understood in 1901 that Civil War history was written not only in the accounts he had drafted as a young chaplain in the Union Army, but in the scars his body bore into the 20th century. African American soldiers did not all wait until 1901 to articulate their understanding of the role of injuries and sickness in their path toward freedom. Medical practice, illness, and wounds played a crucial part in evolving notions of freedom, citizenship, and patriotism for African Americans during the Civil War. Disease, wounds, malnutrition, and poor housing were among the grimmest realities that African Americans faced during wartime. Black soldiers' illnesses and wounds were concrete and distressing realities. Wartime emancipation and African Americans' participation in the war effort as armed soldiers produced new understandings of Black soldiers' wounds and the medical care that they needed. In their letters that were written and dictated from hospitals and camps, often to literate friends and colleagues or white nurses, they demanded care, and Black soldiers did not long for the type of medical care they had experienced under slavery, where a master made medical decisions under the rubric of paternalism and racial hierarchy. Rather, they generally wanted adequate and modern care in a well-run and adequately staffed hospital. In 1865, one African American soldier took his grievances directly to the Secretary of War, asking that he and his fellow soldiers be moved to a more healthy location. He first told of the illnesses afflicting the men in his camp. He wrote, "We have been carrying as high as 5 and 6 men to the hospital in day after day, and we've been doing the likes, and I suppose as long as we shall stay here in such a forsaken place, we shall continue to do so and to do it." He made explicit his sense of a broken contract, writing, "We have come out like men, and we expected to be treated as men, but we have been treated more like dogs than men." Detailing further the conditions of his camp, he expressed his hope for a new location. "Our hospital is full of sick men, and our camp is laying about 1/2 of the men in camp are cripples, and still they report 400 for duty. We are surrounded with ponds and chills and fevers and diseases of every kind. I hope it won't be but a short time before we shall be removed from here." He added, "Please excuse the bad writing and also my mistakes." Nimron Raleigh, an African-American soldier, referred to the unwritten contract between soldier and nation when he dictated his letter to President Lincoln in 1864. He wrote, "We are not treated like we are soldiers in colleague at all. We are deprived of the most important things we need in health and in sickness." In addition to insufficient rations, the poor quality of medical care formed the central point of his message as he wrote, "As for the sick, it is a shocking thing to look into their conditions. Death must be their doom when once they have got to hospital, never to return again. Such is the medical assistance of the 20th Regiment, New York." Many of these black soldiers had been enslaved only months before writing letters to President Lincoln and the Secretary of War. And this twin investment in both modern state-provided medical care and the contract of military service, of which they saw medical care as a part, was significant for them and for white doctors and nurses who observed and cared for them. For soldiers and caregivers alike, the soldiers' medical needs and the care they felt they deserved became a path to understanding their emancipation. Even in the midst of reporting bad medical treatment and dangerous conditions, black soldiers' letters are full of avowals of patriotism. One man described his unit's predicament within the context of his honorable relationship to the government and the Union cause. He said, "I do not say the government is using us. I do not believe the government knows anything about how we are treated. We came out to be true Union soldiers, the grandsons of Mother Africa, never to flinch from duty. Please not to think I am finding fault with the rules of the government. If this be the rules, I am willing to abide by them." As soldiers in African American regiments began to engage the enemy, receive wounds, and suffer through amputations and surgeries, often dying in Army hospitals and in the presence of Northern doctors and nurses, the icon of wounded African Americans began to take on new symbolic weight, not only for black soldiers, but for white doctors and nurses. By 1901, when Turner filed his claim for military pension, Plessy versus Ferguson was an established legal precedent, and the penal system, sharecropping, and lynching were taking their own toll on black men's bodies. The black soldiers' words from 1865 that I just read about being the grandsons of Mother Africa, not finding fault with the rules of the government, would have had an ironic rather than patriotic ring to them in 1901. Nevertheless, during the Civil War, where black mortality reached shocking heights, truly, African American soldiers wrote about their wounds as part of a larger contract and a new freedom. Thank you.
Good morning. Although it's nearly noon.
4 minutes.
Yeah, I had to check my watch. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I now spend most of my time in cyberspace, so it's nice to be out in real space. And to be invited to this tremendous occasion. And I was at Eric Foner's talk last night, and he made a very interesting observation about emancipation in the United States being the largest confiscation of property in world history. And I just wanted to sort of speak to that really briefly, because another way of thinking about it is the largest restoration of property to its rightful owners. That's definitely something to be celebrated. Tomorrow, people will gather at Tremont Temple for a dramatic performance exploring the connections between the Haitian Revolution and the end of slavery in the United States. Celebrating the coming of freedom in the American Civil War is quite appropriate, as Americans in 2013 commemorate the sesquicentennial of the Emancipation Proclamation and the advent of black military service in the Union Army. What most of the audience in Tremont Temple will be unaware of, though, is that the location hosted another notable celebration of freedom over 125 years ago, when about 300 former black soldiers and sailors, as well as their supporters, gathered there in August 1887 for the only known national reunion of black Civil War veterans. The gathering occurred in Boston because although it drew veterans from outside the Northeast, the core participants were from the black Massachusetts regiments, not only the legendary 54th Massachusetts, but also its sister regiments, the 55th Massachusetts Infantry and the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. The reunion's timing seems to have been the result of two factors. First, the 1880s saw a significant increase of activity by Civil War veterans in general, as men who had eagerly resumed civilian life in 1865 over time became nostalgic about their military service as its horrors faded, and ex-soldiers and sailors increasingly assumed an honored place in American society. Second, for all Civil War veterans, Union and Confederate, the 1880s saw an escalation in the battle over the Civil War's meaning and legacy. In other words, a conflict over the Civil War and memory. For black veterans, to a degree unmatched by their white counterparts, Union or Confederate, the conflict over memory had serious practical consequences both for themselves and their race. The war had resulted not only in the end of slavery, but also led to the establishment of fundamental constitutional rights that, on paper at least, made African Americans free and equal citizens of the United States. Yet black veterans in the late 1880s could not help but see these rights and the very security of African Americans were under attack, especially in the states of the former Confederacy, where in the wake of Reconstruction, white Southerners sought to reestablish racial supremacy. And so, while the gathering of black veterans on August the 2nd and 3rd of 1887 at Tremont Temple was a joyous celebration of what they had achieved a quarter century before, it also was a sobering occasion to rededicate themselves to defending their race's hard-won gains from the Civil War. The veterans selected as their presiding officer James Monroe Trotter, one of the few African Americans commissioned as a line officer in a black regiment, becoming a lieutenant in the 55th Massachusetts Infantry late in his service. Trotter was no doubt chosen for the role of presiding officer because in 1887 he was the recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, making him at the time one of the most prominent political appointees of African descent in the country. For instance, one of his predecessors in that role had been none other than Frederick Douglass. Trotter gave the opening address to the convention, reminding them of the great risk that had set apart their military service. He said, quote, "Your lot, comrades, was not like the white man's. You well understood that your enemies in the South would give you no quarter," unquote. James Monroe Trotter was followed on the speaker's podium by Alfred Hartwell and Norwood Hollowell, both high-ranking white officers of black Massachusetts troops during the Civil War. Indeed, it is notable that a number of white officers of the black regiments joined their former soldiers in Boston, demonstrating that their wartime alliance was still alive over 2 decades later. After their speeches, the former soldiers and their officers assembled on the nearby Boston Common, where they paraded to the applause of a sizable crowd, including the governor of Massachusetts and the mayor of Boston. The evening saw more speeches, most notably by William H. Carney, the hero of the Battle of Fort Wagner. I talk more about that, but of course we've got to limit ourselves for time. If the first day of the Black Veterans Reunion had been a celebration of their military service in the Civil War, the second day, the former soldiers at the morning business meeting turned to the current problems of their race. By 1887, as previously noted, increasingly African Americans found not only their citizenship rights violated, but also sometimes their lives at risk as white people, especially in the South, turned to violence to punish transgressors of white supremacy, and more generally, to terrorize the black population into submission. As a resolution drawn up by the veterans aptly put it, quote, "The stubborn and colossal fact stands out boldly, wickedly, and cruelly that American citizens of African descent, survivors of their brave dead comrades who placed in peril life and limb for the preservation of the Union and their kindred today in a large portion of this great nation are denied justice in the courts, deprived of the exercise of the elective franchise, the victims of mob violence, an unprotected and outraged people," unquote. The black veterans at Tremont Temple demanded the federal government, indebted to them for their Civil War service, use its power to protect their race from violence and guarantee their constitutional rights. The reunion also called upon white veterans to turn away from reconciliation with their former Confederate enemies, which was becoming increasingly common, and join them in guaranteeing the safety and citizenship rights of African Americans. In addition, they advocated for a memorial in Washington, D.C. to commemorate the service of black Union soldiers and sailors, and demanded that the Grand Army of the Republic, the principal Union veterans organization, take action against white Union veterans in Louisiana and Mississippi, who at that moment were seeking to force former soldiers into a separate regional organization or department, as they were called, instead of permitting them to join the existing one there. After the business meeting, the veterans closed out the reunion by traveling by boat to Hingham, Massachusetts. There they decorated the grave of Governor John Andrew, who of course had been an early champion of black military service in the Civil War. This act highlighted an important attribution of the convention. While a meeting of black Union veterans, as previously noted, the Tremont Temple gathering had a manifestly biracial character, and not merely because many former white officers of black regiments attended. That is, the ex-soldiers and sailors there made a point to honor not just their own service, but a variety of white heroes who had supported them and the black race before, during, and after the Civil War. For example, in addition to Governor Andrew, the assembled veterans also pointedly paid tribute to John Brown, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, General Benjamin Butler, and others. The celebration of white champions of by African Americans at Tremont Temple was characteristic of black veterans generally and their Civil War memory. It was common for these men after the war, through acts of commemoration, to honor all Americans who risked themselves for the black race, regardless of their background. For example, numerous black GAR posts were named for various white Americans in addition to prominent African Americans, as well as significant international figures of African descent. No doubt the veterans hoped with this interracial commemoration they could rekindle white support for their struggles to maintain voting rights and citizenship rights and gain protection against racial violence. Their hopes were not entirely in vain. The Tremont veterans, as will be recalled, had demanded the Grand Army of the Republic prevent the exclusion of black veterans from the department in Louisiana and Mississippi. While the 1887 reunion cannot take the entire credit, it is worth noting that the GAR ultimately refused to allow white veterans there to exclude black veterans, and the national leadership went as far as to purge departmental officers who refused to accept African Americans, paving the way for the participation of black veterans in the existing GAR department in Louisiana and Mississippi. White veterans then, responding to pressure from the 1887 Black Veterans Convention and elsewhere, refused to betray their former black comrades, at least within the Grand Army of the Republic. Indeed, while the segregation of many local posts would constitute a necessary concession to Jim Crow in the South and elsewhere, some local posts in the North accepted black members, and in some instances, African Americans became post officers, and a few even rose to become commanders of interracial posts and officers of GAR departments. Yet the sad fact remains that when it came to the status of African Americans more generally, which was at the heart of the concerns of black veterans at Tremont Temple in August 1887, they largely found indifference from white Union veterans, who, while they might be grateful to African Americans for risking their lives for the Union during the Civil War and maintain some semblance of racial inclusion in the GAR, proved unwilling to push for meaningful federal intervention to save citizenship rights and black lives from the terror inflicted on African Americans in the late 19th century. So while black veterans at Boston in August 1887 and elsewhere proved unable to preserve all their race's gains from the Civil War, neither did they let them evaporate without a fight. Indeed, if no sustained black veterans movement for civil rights and security emerged from the 1887 reunion, it was partly because they were already a dwindling group, and this is where I sort of tie into Gretchen's Long's paper. By 1890, that's the 1890 Veterans Census, only about a quarter of black soldiers and sailors of the Civil War were still alive, compared to over half of white veterans, Union and Confederate. Despite their dwindling numbers, some black veterans would remain players in the civil rights struggle until their generation passed from the scene. For instance, John B. Anderson, an ex-USCT soldier from Annapolis, Maryland, would play a notable role in the legal wrangling that ultimately led to the U.S. Supreme Court decision of Gwynn v. Oklahoma in 1915, declaring the grandfather clause unconstitutional. And as one speaker at the 1887 reunion noted, that however endangered were African Americans and their citizenship rights, without question, slavery was dead forever in the United States. And in that respect, the veterans at Tremont Temple reunion could justifiably rejoice in their role in making it happen. Let us, in 2013, rejoice with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our panelists.
Yeah. Yes, and now questions, and we've moved the microphones to either side, so if you would come up and then first identify yourself and then ask your question.
And as we have someone, just as we have someone approaching that microphone, oh yes, there we are. Just one little footnote for the people who are going to Tremont Temple Baptist Church tomorrow. You won't be in the same one. There was a big fire there in 1893, and so you have the new version of Tremont Temple built in 1896.
That's why I said same location,
That's
not
right,
same building.
exactly. I just wanted to make sure that was clear. I didn't want people, leaning on the walls and trying to connect with James Trotter. Right. Yes.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Larry Finnison. I'm doing some work on the Company L of the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Militia in the 1880s and 1890s, and I'm wondering about the connection between that unit and some of the veterans of the 54th. That is to say, did the veterans continue their military connection through the avenue of the Massachusetts Volunteer Militias into the 1880s, 1890s, and even beyond? Do you know of that unit? And it had its own black officers. It was also claimed to be the first black unit to have its own black officers in the U.S., but that was a contemporaneous claim, and it looks like you mentioned the name Trotter as being a prior example of that in the Civil War.
I can't speak specifically to the 54th Massachusetts, but I do know that Christian Fleetwood, who was in the 4th U.S. Colored Infantry, was involved in the District of Columbia militia after the Civil War. So you certainly find black Civil War veterans of militia, but I don't know about Massachusetts.
What? Come on, microphone, please. And identify yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Peggy Wiesenberg, a member of the public from Boston and a lawyer. Byron, I would like to ask you, as black veterans moved from military service into civil society, one might think that they would be able to get jobs in police and fire and other public domains. And yet, our civil service laws in Massachusetts, I don't know when they were enacted, they had a veteran's preference, but as you know, in the more recent period, blacks could not get those civil service jobs. And brought legal suits to get on the police and fire forces in the Commonwealth. So I'm just wondering about this and your thoughts. And I ask you because you've been in our legislature and you're our historian.
Just one thing about the veterans' preference. Veterans' preference is a relatively new piece of the civil service law, but the answer is that jobs in Boston around for the police department and the fire department where African Americans had the same competition that they had in any jobs. And so they had the same competition and there was the same discrimination that existed there in any jobs. There's only been, it's actually just recently that there's been a research done on the first African American policemen in Boston, and in there it was a direct tie to African Americans being elected who were able to get them the jobs at the end of the 19th century. So it was early African American city councilors in Boston that were able to get them jobs, and then when African Americans, when you had that period when we had no elected African American officials, they did, most of them for a variety of reasons left the police department. And by the end of World War I, there were no African Americans in the police department in Massachusetts, and that sort of corresponds. So it was more political empowerment that allowed for the jobs in areas like the police department and the fire department, and not the fact that you were a veteran. Though veterans seem to have, when you look at educated African Americans, men in the early 20th century in Boston and Cambridge, they tended to be people who had some military connection, right? And sort of one of the more famous would be Gordine, who was a lawyer and an Olympic star and always stayed in the National Guard in that same company.
Let me just jump in here real quick. In researching my book on Black Civil War veterans, James Monroe Trotter, who I was talking about in my paper, worked for the post office after the Civil War, and his appointment there and several other veterans, I believe of the 55th, was, I think, pretty much clearly tied to their Civil War service. So there wasn't a formal veterans preference, but in some instances you find informal preferences given. Of course, this is the post office, federal, not
Right.
Boston City or the state of Massachusetts.
And federal before President Wilson.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
But federal when the civil service was integrated.
Yeah.
If I could say something as well, in the American South around Darien, Georgia, which was the town burned here, it became an enclave of black power until about 1907 with the machine that Tunis Campbell set up and Henry McNeil Turner set up as a senator. But most of those positions in the police department, the sheriff's position was elected, and then the sheriff would pick deputies based upon who could shoot and who had been in the army. And also the organizers in the county who were African American justices of the peace put together militia units who were former members of different regiments in the area. And so there was a preference in that sense of things, I think. But of course nothing like civil service exams in the South either.
William
for a long time.
Kearney of the 54th Massachusetts, wasn't he? Post office. Yeah, post office, but also later wasn't he the clerk of the legislature or something of that sort?
No.
Okay. He had some. What did he do? He did something in the legislature, didn't he?
I don't think so. I have to check that. Right.
I mean, not as a representative,
Right,
of course,
no,
but
right.
Another question?
Yes, I want to thank you very much for all your discussions and presentations. My name is Paul Barron. I'm here at the Radcliffe Institute. And especially your narratives, the stories you wove together to form, for those of us who aren't students of this very much, really compelling. I wanted to focus a question for you, Professor Duncan. I don't know anything about Colonel James Montgomery, but I was very intrigued by the way you framed the motivation for acting militarily by his group and cohort, and then units or groups within his fighting element, and those from the 54th, and different motivations. What became of James Montgomery?
He died in 1871 of consumption back in Kansas. Basically left the field in early '64, about the same time Higginson came back to Massachusetts.
Hello, I had a question for you, Donald.
Please identify yourself first.
Lois Brown, Wesleyan University. So Donald, you mentioned in the events around the 1887 reunion, much of the work that the men were doing. And I wonder if you found any details about women's auxiliaries that were contributing to the events, because later on we know that the Women's Relief Corps, for instance, it was the sister and ladies unit of the Grand Army of the Republic Post, really worked closely with them. So I'm wondering if in the reportage there's any evidence of a woman's touch at all on the proceedings.
They were there. I can tell you that much. The problem is I don't know a lot about the backstory of this convention. I found out about it. I was in George T. Garrison's papers. That's William Lloyd Garrison's son, who served as an officer in the 55th Massachusetts. And he had clippings from Boston newspapers in his scrapbook. And, it did mention, the fact that, the women, prepared food and did other things for the meeting. But other than that, I can't really see anything more. I mean, it's something I've certainly thought about, and if I was to develop this into a paper, I think this would be a wonderful thing, for instance, for the Disunion blog in the New York Times. That's definitely an issue I'd want to find more about, and if anybody knows where to look, come and see me.
Another question.
Yes, good morning. My name is Carol Hector Harris. My great-great-grandfather, Charles Henry Tyler, served in the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. And Professor Shaffer, when you were talking about the reunion that happened in August of 1887, my mind just took me away. And it's because the entire time that I was growing up here in Boston, every year on August 1st, for some reason we never understood, we went to Crescent Park in Providence, Rhode Island, to celebrate Emancipation Day. The entire family went, and it was like a family reunion. Well, it wasn't until my sister and I were talking about this activity about 10 years ago, we asked, whose emancipation was that on August 1st? And not long thereafter, I ended up in Trinidad for their emancipation celebration, and it dawned on me, we were observing the emancipation of slavery in the British colonies. We never knew why we did it when we were kids, but it took me into my 50s being in Trinidad to discover why my entire family did something when I was a kid. So I'm wondering, did they have this event in early August of 1887? Did they choose that date because of emancipation in the British colonies?
To be perfectly honest with you, I don't know. But, this brings up the whole, issue of the timing of emancipation celebrations. And I recently had a debate online with a prominent historian, I won't say who. If you really want to know, go and search my blog. And basically, this historian wanted the federal government to create a holiday commemorating, the Emancipation Proclamation. Specifically, either January the 1st or back in September when the preliminary was made. And I didn't really think that was very appropriate because, one of the things you find out about people celebrating emancipation is the slaves celebrated it when they actually became free. Not when somebody else said you're free, but when they realized, hey, we're free. And that's why you have the Juneteenth down in Texas. And if you go to other places in the South or the Caribbean, they tend to celebrate freedom when they actually became free.
But the August 1st date, of course, was very important before the Civil War in the black community. It was a day that was celebrated, and so you can find documents about celebrations of British emancipation. Both Frederick Douglass's famous speech was done on a British Emancipation Day anniversary. So it was very popular here, though not very popular afterwards. And then, of course, for some, I'm not sure why, but it became popular in the British West Indies to have their Independence Day on that day. So most of the islands, when they became independent, used that day as their Independence Day.
Another question.
Yes, hi. My name is Rosalind Elder. I'm from Boston. Question about the military, the veterans from the Civil War. Veterans from every war, they possess a lot of courage, and the African Americans during the Civil War, even more so because they knew they were going to be subject to, incredible atrocities if they were captured. My question is, how many veterans, is there any data on how many veterans from the Civil War in the South, I guess particularly because maybe it wouldn't happen in the North, were lynching victims? Because lynching was the way that, the South was trying to sort of make sure people knew their place, and veterans, I think, were sort of pointed out as people who were very defiant and had a militant streak. And were they sort of, pointed out, or sort of, were they sort of used as lynching victims more so than other parts of the population?
Yes and no. I know in North Carolina, there were a few servicemen who became targeted in the first year when tensions, adjustments are the most difficult and most bitter. But in North Carolina, at least, the areas that the black servicemen had come from were the same place they went back to. And there, the lynching tended to be cases I've come across in the Piedmont. Areas along the coast, the Black Second, places like that. The black servicemen tended to cluster together in mutual support. Many of them had taken their rifles and pistols home with them. They provided, if you wanted to find victims, more difficult victims. So in those cases, I don't think the veterans were as vulnerable as some other people. But that's just my little knowledge in especially eastern North Carolina.
I really can't say that much about really later on, although I've come across at least a few cases of black veterans who seem to have been targeted. But if you look at the two great riots that happened soon after the Civil War in Memphis and New Orleans, black Civil War veterans figure very prominently in both of those events. So I can't speak to late 19th century lynching, but if you look at Reconstruction, they're all over the place. But please keep in mind that by the late 19th century, there's not a lot of black veterans left compared to whites. Like I said, about 28% are still alive in 1890, whereas well over 50% of white veterans on both sides of the war were still alive.
We have time for you. Go ahead.
Oh, I would just echo that. In Memphis, I know that black veterans had just given up their weapons right before that riot. So lynching, informal violence, riot violence, right, at the end of the war. I also know there were some black veterans involved in a skirmish at a hospital in Tennessee, and that was also in 1866, and they were killed, and a black woman as well.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Yes, hi, my name is Lisa Cox, and my question is for Mr. Russell Duncan. When you spoke of Montgomery, Colonel Montgomery and Shaw, my question for you is can you elaborate a little bit more, or do you know, actually, their relationship one between another? It seems like Montgomery was more of a radical when it came to doing and being able to not portray, but actually act out that freedom and deliverance that you spoke of, and as far as the other soldiers, more was about freedom and equity. So can you elaborate a little bit more, if you know anything about their relationship, on how it may have had effects on the soldiers, the black soldiers, as they moved forward in the Civil War?
Okay, yeah, I'm very much interested in the comparison between the two, and also by what Lois Brown said today about Harriet Tubman and Montgomery and Charlotte Fortin and Shaw and maybe Susie King Taylor and Higginson, and what they thought each of those different avenues of advance might bring for African Americans. In 1863, Montgomery was 50 years old. Shaw was 25, 26. Higginson was 39. And Montgomery was famous. I mean, as I tried to say, if John Brown is calling him notorious, I mean, it's something, you know. Robert Gould Shaw said of Montgomery that he was a most attractive man. Higginson said that he was splendid but impulsive. And I think that there is a great difference in the monetary assets and the families behind those three men, but let's say two, Shaw and Montgomery. Shaw himself, of course, having the finest things all his life, and Montgomery not so much. Montgomery had moved from Ashtabula to the Licking River Valley following the disciples of Christ, Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell. And then he married two slave owners' daughters, began to have children, moved to Missouri, and was there the day that he was able to cross the river and claim a homestead. He was anti-slavery in the way that Eric Foner told us Lincoln was anti-slavery. He wasn't particularly racist, maybe not racist at all. He simply felt that there was a difference in, again, I mean, if we look at Eric's work, there was something valuable in freedom. Freedom was more than nothing. Eric reminded us some time ago. And so I think that what he was able to instill in his charges, if you will, was a feeling that this truly was a religious moment and that there was a higher law involved with the men. He called them together before each and every raid or rescue upriver, if you will. He prayed with them. He sang with them, hymns with them. He meant John Brown to them. When Robert Gould Shaw came in, of course, in the 54th Massachusetts, fabulous formation of the regiment that was formed by people at Reedville Camp. Surgeon Lincoln Stone was taking out at least 1/3 of all the applicants to be in the 54th Mass. This was the finest set of men you can imagine. Montgomery had a different group to work with. He had people to work with who were not selected in that way. He would sign on anyone. And some of the men he signed on were in their late 50s, maybe older, and as young as 14 years old. So I think, if I understand the question here, is that as the men of the 54th looked at the 2nd South Carolina, and the 2nd South Carolina looked at them, back, there was a dream of what could be possible with freedom and equality. But first, political scientists will say you have to decide the question between freedom and order, and how much the police state's going to allow freedom when it's putting down rule of law in the U.S. Constitution and otherwise. And I think the question that we've all been discussing is the question between freedom and equality, which is the second dilemma, not the first. The first is how much order is taken away from freedom, and the second is how much equality. So I think the men of South Carolina and Florida and Georgia joined the discussion, and the women too, although I don't know much about that either, unfortunately.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists today. And we will reassemble in 1 hour in this room to continue this fabulous conference. Thank you.